much. Somebody once reviewed a book of speeches somebody had put out, my speeches, and his comment was, he never seems to go to a place at which he isn't happy to be there. Well, of course I'm not going to places I'm not happy to be there. And I'm very, very happy to be here with many people whom I've worked with over the years, with former students, and with an institution which has worked very hard to improve its standing in the world and has succeeded greatly in doing that. And I believe Francesco, and I believe President Monti, and many others who are in the audience today are responsible for raising the name of Italian economics to a totally different level than it was 25 years ago. Nowadays, I say to people who visit the Fed, if you want to know what's going on here, just go up and down in the elevators. You need to know only 3 languages. One is English, the second is Chinese, and the third is Italian. And that's the people who are making the work of the staff of the Fed, among others, and it is a very important function, and I think it probably also serves in Italy to raise the level of economics here. I would also like to mention, although I think this is not strictly allowed, that Francesco has had an enormous effect on the quality of economics in Italy and the understanding that Italian economics is far away from where it was when almost the only Italian of note at MIT on the faculty and among the students was Franco Modigliani. Now, it was hard not to exceed Franco's capacities because they were enormous, but it was very important to not make it a one-man show, and it is not a one-man show now. It's a multi-person creation of a body of students and faculty of much higher ability than it was before, and one that meets global standards. Second, I want to talk a little bit about some of the articles that Francesco is famous for. One of the earliest of them was an article which said that if you sometimes try to undertake a fiscal contraction, that is, excuse the expression on that side of the group, that is reducing government spending, that this may be expansionary. And it was based on the experience of Denmark and of Ireland, 2 countries which had succeeded by tightening their budgets and getting them under control. And it seemed, you could argue, that the economy was growing more because of that contraction than it would have if the contraction hadn't taken place. Well, it got a lot of attention. It got everybody very excited. It's not entirely clear that it's true, but it is certainly true that if you run a decent fiscal policy, you can frequently do better than you were doing when you were running a sloppy fiscal policy, as many countries do. That was the first one. The second was not a paper, but a set of papers and books together with Alberto Alesina, and they are also on fiscal policy, and they make many a case for how to strengthen fiscal policy. By the way, we've all been talking here about strengthening Italian fiscal policy. There's another country in Europe that needs to strengthen its fiscal policy, and that is Germany. What it is doing now is not creative for anybody. And it is important that it step up to the plate and spend money and increase the level of economic activity in the European Common Market and in the European Union. And I hope that happens, and I hope we don't have to wait, as was mentioned, for another global financial crisis before Germany does it again. But what Franco and Alberto, I'm thinking of a different generation when I say Franco and Alberto. That's Franco Modigliani and Alberto Ando. They used to work together, and my mind just went into that combination of people.
I'm honored to be confused for these people.
I'm not sure you deserve it, but...
As moderator, I think I'll cut that discussion off.
Excuse me, let me say that what I meant was I didn't think they deserved that comparison. Franco did. And the work on policy that Francesco has done has been beyond Italy. It was said earlier by Richard Portis. It was in the context of the institution, I don't know if you head it, Richard, but anyway, the CEPR. CEPR?
CEPR, yes.
CEPR. The European, I think of it as the European equivalent of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it's not identical, but it's done an enormous amount, as has the NBER for American research and the American research community. It's done the same thing in Europe that the NBER did in the United States. I'd like to speak last about a fiscal policy initiative that a few colleagues and I have been working on in BlackRock. And this is one which is close to heresy among some, because it proposes taking advantage of the fact that you can print money without having it worsen the budget deficit. The idea is as follows. We have very high levels of debt in Europe, in the United States. Now, if you're an optimist, you say, well, the interest rate is low, and actually what we're getting at the moment is very cheap fiscal policy, and the debt seems much larger, but the debt in terms of the burden that it is on the economy is not much larger, it's much smaller. And the amount of, for instance, in the American budget today, the amount of interest at a debt level of about 90% is much lower than it was at a debt level of 70% of GDP. So that situation is a bit mixed. But what you don't want anybody to believe is that you can go on spending, deficit spending without any consequences. So the proposal is as follows, that the Federal Reserve announce in response to a government request how much it thinks the money supply can be increased through a transfer from the central bank to the government, which the Fed will calculate how much is possible to print without any adverse consequences for inflation. Any consequence for inflation starts off not being in America, in the United States or here, starts off not being adverse. It starts off getting the inflation rate up to where we'd like it to be. At some later stage, it can be adverse. And that the agreement that is made is one between the Fed, and the fiscal authority on how much can be spent on fiscal spending for an addition to the budget. So it's a way of getting an effectively positive fiscal policy at almost zero cost in terms of its impact on the debt, but on a positive impact on output. And that can be done. Now, people who want to tell us we're heretics, and I guess this is not the city which figures out who the heretics are. That must be in Spain somewhere. But the idea of that you can spend, the government can spend money with no consequences, whatever, is mentioned frequently by those people who believe in MMT, modern monetary theory, as it's called in the United States. This is not that, because they don't say there are limits to what you can do here. That's why the Fed has to be in there doing the calculation of what you can do via creation of money. As long as you're not taking the country into dangerous areas in terms of inflation, other aspects of the budget, this thing is relatively cheap and could be done. We did not, in that article, which you will find on the BlackRock website, we did not in that article describe the institutional framework in which this will work. Why? Because I've been in many occasions over my life in which there's a problem and people come and design a very complicated mechanism to deal with the problem. That complicated mechanism of how many people will be on the fiscal advisory board and how many people will be here usually attracts a great deal of attention and allows them to say, it doesn't make any sense. I said there should be 7 members of the board and they only want 5. That's terrible. That's not the level at which this has to be thought about. It has to be thought about, does the basic idea make sense? I think it does. I think it should receive further attention from major institutions in the United States, in Europe, and maybe the Chinese will do it, or maybe they're already doing it, for all we know. And I hope that we go ahead and look at this with the seriousness that I think the proposal deserves. Thank you.
Thank you. A difficulty. See, you've got some converts already.
Pardon?
You have some converts already. A difficulty, of course, is knowing, indeed, how much you can expand the money supply without provoking inflation to a great degree. And you will recall that when QE began, some distinguished American economists said, hyperinflation is around the corner. Well, it hasn't come, has it? But
you're supporting my argument.
I am.
Okay.
I'm just saying. The question is, what's the number? You might want to come back to that. But our final panelist in this first round is Charles Biplos.